Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be continuing our look at the worst vehicle of each rank at War Thunder with the rank 5 vehicle. And as a reminder for the series, we will be excluding any vehicle that is not in the main tech tree and also anti-aircraft vehicles. If you want a more in-depth explanation as to why, you can feel free to check out the first video in this series. And today's winner for the worst vehicle is the Raketenautomat. And the Raketenautomat is rather an interesting choice because I was not expecting it to be here. I actually played it a bit when I was going up the German tech tree, but I didn't actually fully spade it, so this gave me an opportunity to go back and revisit it. The Raketen is currently sitting at a 37.4% win rate with 0.76 kills per spawn and 0.87 kills per death. And it turns out this had to happen eventually. This is in fact the lowest win rate of any vehicle that we have seen so far in this series, and is currently the second lowest of any ground realistic vehicle in the entire game of War Thunder. The only vehicle beating it is the German Zerstotter 45 anti-aircraft vehicle, which is excluded from this list because it's an AA, so this is the lowest win rate that we will be seeing. In fact, you can find this very easily by going to StatShark and simply sorting by win rate in the negative, and you will see it basically at the top. Now this also wraps around to another rather interesting topic before we go into the Raketen itself, and that is the Raketen's kills per spawn and kills per death aren't bad. In fact, they're kind of average for the game. So why is its win rate so abysmal? And a lot of people have quoted on previous videos that they think that win rate is not necessarily the best determining factor, and maybe you should go with something like kills per death. In general, I feel like any one stat that you're going to use is not necessarily going to tell the whole picture. It might be interesting to do another version of this series, but looking at essentially both win rate and kills per death and kills per spawn, and basically averaging those out together. But for the time being, we are just going to finish this out with just win rate. And you might think, how does a vehicle that actually has a pretty decent kills per death, or at least pretty average kills per death, have such an abysmal win rate? It might seem like a bit of an anomaly, but I do have some theories as to why the Raketen is currently performing so poorly. When I went back and played it, there were a few trends that I'll go into at the end of the video that showed up that does kind of betray why this vehicle might not be doing particularly well. And as we always do, we're going to be starting off with mobility, and the mobility on the Raketen is not as good as you would really think. It does look like it's a relatively light and fast vehicle, however looks can be deceiving. While it only weighs 16 tons, it only has a 220 horsepower engine, so that's only about 14 horsepower per ton. That is an incredibly poor power to weight ratio. On top of that, the forward and reverse speeds are not particularly impressive either. At only 55 kilometers an hour forward and 13 kilometers an hour in reverse, the Raketen is not exactly impressive. It's going to be pretty similar to most of the MBTs around your battle rating. In fact, some of the other MBTs, like the Leopard that you can use alongside this in the German lineup, actually do generally perform better on the mobility front. The mobility is not really a weak point, it's not abysmal, but it's definitely not a strong suit. And the 13 kilometers an hour reverse gear, it's good enough to back off of a corner, but it's not great for getting you out of bad situations quickly, especially because the poor power to weight can sometimes lead to a pretty poor hull traverse as well, especially on softer ground. So the vehicle can be a lot more awkward to use in the mobility category than it maybe looks like at a glance, especially because physically the vehicle does look kind of small and kind of agile, but this is, as I said, pretty deceptive. In reality, it's basically the same mobility-wise as your average MBT around this BR, something like an M48 or a T55. Moving on to the protection aspect, and this is yet another pretty underwhelming feature. The maximum protection you're really going to get across any armor value is only about 30 millimeters. That means from a lot of angles, this vehicle can be taken out by just roof-mounted 50 cals, which is a bit awkward in a lot of scenarios. That also means this vehicle is absolutely allergic to any kind of autocannon. Any fast-firing gun with half-decent penetration or even pretty poor penetration is really going to take this vehicle out pretty quickly. So a lot of light tanks and anti-airs around this battle rating, even something like a Bradley that doesn't have the fastest firing gun, is a serious threat to this vehicle. On top of that, the vehicle only has 3 crew members, and all 3 of them are located in the front of the vehicle, which is pretty awkward. It does make the vehicle very easy to take out by basically any shot. It doesn't exactly have a spacious interior to kind of spread out the damage, or a lot of internal bulkheads or components that can absorb shrapneling. So on the whole, most of the time, penetrating hits will just straight up kill it. But that's not even the worst part of the durability. The turret of the vehicle is located very far to the front of the vehicle, which is nice, but also means it's a lot easier for somebody to hit your engine in such a way that your turret can't hit them if your engine is slightly poking around a corner. So the vehicle is actually very easy to exploit in this kind of way, in that all the enemy really needs to do is just set you on fire 3 times and kill you. Of course, the problems for the Raketen in the protection category don't stop there, because it turns out the magazines on top of the main rocket launchers are actually ammo that can detonate and will destroy your vehicle if hit. And these are actually taller than the launchers themselves, so if you're trying to peek over a hill, opponents will see these first and can shoot these first and take out your vehicle. This also kind of means that your vehicle is never truly safe. There's never a position you can occupy where your vehicle can't simply be outright killed, because if you're poking the back of the vehicle out, they can just disable the engine and set you on fire 3 times. If you're poking just the turret out, they can hit the magazine. If you're poking the front out, they can kill all 3 of your crew members, etc, etc, etc. It's like basically no matter what you do with this vehicle, you are always exceedingly vulnerable to any incoming fire. While I can safely say the mobility is not a strength, I would say the overall protection really isn't a strength of this vehicle either. Moving on to the firepower, and the first limitation to understand about this vehicle's firepower is that it doesn't have any kind of machine gun whatsoever, so knocking down fences is going to be a bit of an issue, especially because your primary rounds all involve explosive rounds. That being said, the rate of fire on those guns is high enough that you can just spam it out, but it is something you need to consider when setting up a position. Additionally, it's important to remember the gun mounting on this is not stabilized and also doesn't have the best traverse or elevation rates in the world, so it can be a little awkward to try and snap it to targets quickly if they're not at super close ranges. Of course, the star of the show is the 2 rocket launchers located on your turret. You have a left and a right one. They both fire independently and they both have a 9-round magazine. These rocket launchers have access to both a heat and a high explosive round. However, the high explosive round is borderline useless because the heat round also does an overpressure effect. So unless it's a vehicle that is lightly armored but not open topped, which are pretty uncommon, you really don't need the high explosive for anything, so you might as well just only take the heat. Additionally, with the heat rounds, the penetration is functionally irrelevant, and what I mean by that is most opponents are either not going to have any protection against heat rounds, just basic rolled homogeneous armor, in which case the round will always go through, or alternatively they will have protection, things like ERA, hard kill systems, or spaced armor, in which case the round will really struggle. So most of the time this vehicle is pure binary, it either always goes through or never goes through. Now, as I said at the beginning of the firepower section, the rate of fire on these launchers is fairly obscene. You can almost fire it as fast as you can pull the trigger, and this does give the vehicle the ability to basically be very forgiving in terms of firepower, because if your first shot doesn't quite kill the enemy, you can land the follow-up shot basically instantly. On top of that, at the 8.0 BR bracket, a lot of vehicles are still older World War II or very early Cold War vehicles that aren't the most responsive in terms of gun handling, so a lot of them won't be able to rotate their turret fast enough to react to you start shooting at them anyways, which is pretty fortunate because, as I said, you are weak to any roof-mounted autocannons or heavy machine guns that the enemy might have, so that can be a bit of an issue. This also brings up one of the more unusual parts of this vehicle, in that the Raketen is one of only a handful of vehicles in the game to have a secondary weapon. The first launcher, if you just hit the main trigger button, is only going to fire from the left side. If you want to fire from the right side, you have to hit the secondary fire button, which requires a specific button map. This also can make the vehicle a little awkward because you have to change the perspective and parallax from where you're shooting if you want to alternate launchers, and if you only fire from one launcher, you're going to deplete it very quickly because you only have a handful of shots. With all that being said, I would still definitely rate the firepower as an advantage. You can generally one-hit kill most opponents without that much difficulty, mostly by hitting on the middle, and even if you don't one-hit kill them, the follow-up shots are incredibly rapid that a lot of opponents won't be able to react in that time frame. So if you can line up shots, killing enemies is not that difficult, on top of the fact that because these are effectively RPG rounds, they have a pretty flat trajectory, at least out to most combat ranges. At very long ranges it does get a little awkward, but on the whole, the launchers themselves are very usable. So overall, giving you some of my thoughts on the vehicle, and I'm going to show you the Raketen's current stats in global versus my stats. I had a 59% win rate with 47 deaths and 69 kills. So on the whole, I did actually outperform the average win rate by a pretty massive amount, over 20%, and I'm incredibly confused by this result if I'm being completely honest. Generally speaking, a lot of times part of your win rate is dictated by your teams, especially in a game like War Thunder, where if you start getting surrounded, it's very easy to get overwhelmed and killed. So beating the average win rate by 20%, even if the sample size isn't the largest, is incredibly unusual, and I did spay this over the course of a few different days. I didn't do this all in one sitting. So you would think that I would be at least closer to the 37%. I'm not really sure what's going on here. It's certainly possible that at this battle rating, the German teams are generally thin enough that individual player skill becomes more of a factor, especially because a lot of the early Cold War vehicles do have a lot of eccentricities about them that you kind of have to keep in mind when you're using them, so maybe that's a thing, but I don't know. Either way, it is kind of an interesting result. That being said, a few observations about the Raketen that makes it maybe not as good as it seems on paper. The first one really is the mobility and the overall responsiveness of the vehicle. It's just often hard to swing the gun around on target rapidly enough to react to an opponent, and on top of that, it's not really that fast in terms of getting to key positions quickly. So you're mostly getting to these positions about the same time that an MBT would, and honestly, you're also getting them a lot slower than most contemporary light tanks would. And this also wraps around to one of the bigger problems with the Raketen, at least in the current meta, and that is everybody's least favorite American light tank, the XM800T. The XM800T is absolutely lousy around this battle rating. It is significantly faster than you, and it has a fully stabilized 20mm that will tear you to pieces even if it only has the default belt. The XM800T is an absolute nemesis to the Raketen because if you want to play in the rat playstyle, the Raketen just doesn't do it anywhere near as well as the XM800T, and all of the positions that you will try to occupy to be a rat, the XM800T is probably already there and will simply tear you to pieces without any effort. I cannot emphasize enough that out of the 47 deaths I had, at least a third of those were just the XM800T alone. On top of that, I do have a running theory as to why the kills per death is actually pretty decent, but the win rate is so god-awful, and a lot of that has to do with the main launchers. The launchers on the Raketen are insanely loud and produce a very large smoke plume, and a lot of players basically know what that is, at least from their experience with vehicles like the Ush that was in the game a lot longer than the Raketen. So this vehicle is actually pretty well known and honestly pretty well hated by a lot of players, so if they hear you fire, they're going to go out of their way to try and kill you, and that happened a lot. You basically get one, maybe two kills, and then the entire enemy team that is in that area would just jump on you. This is of course compounded by the fact that the Raketen is not exactly fast enough to get away in most cases, and is not really responsive enough to handle enemies that may be coming from multiple directions. So on the whole, I feel like there are enough factors holding it back that it's not completely unreasonable that this would have a pretty low win rate, especially if in the hands of less experienced players. That being said, I think 37.4% is probably a lot lower than it really should be, and I am kind of confused as to how it actually gets that low because it seems statistically unlikely, especially because we have a very large sample size of over 12 million games. Of course, going into the tips and tricks, one big thing that I would say and that I would highly recommend is you probably shouldn't play the Raketen like a rat tank. The problem is with the mobility and its susceptibility to things like XM800Ts and also things like the Fox. If you play it like a rat tank, you're probably going to die unceremoniously quite a bit. What you really need to do is you need to play it as a support vehicle in and around your team instead of trying to do a long flank. The relatively poor responsiveness combined with its vulnerability to anything means if you try to do a long flank, it's very easy to just instantly die right away to an XM800T that's doing it better, or get one kill, alert the entire enemy team, and then also die right away. If you stay in and around your team, there's often a lot more opportunities to vulture up kills and support them in ways that can allow you to perform pretty well, but while also not excessively exposing you to a lot of danger. This always feels like a cop-out strategy to say it's a support vehicle, but when you can fire rockets basically as fast as you can pull the trigger, as long as you are around your teammates, it's very hard for the enemy to push your teammates, even if your teammates are on reload or don't have a barrel. So the Raketen does have some value in this area and can also do soft flanks, essentially just wrapping around a group of rocks or a building to try and support a teammate rather than trying to wrap around the entire map. Or to summarize all of that down into a simple one-sentence blurb, the Raketen is about 10% less ratty than it really needs to be a true rat, and thus mostly works better as a support vehicle than a lot of the other vehicles that are kind of similar in nature. Of course, those are just my opinions. Let me know in the comments down below if you agree or disagree, or what your experiences have been with the Raketen. I always love to hear from you guys. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte tschüss.